Hello and welcome to Will's Infinite Library. I'm Will and this is my Infinite Library. I am trying to always keep my channel improving and try new things. And am I covered in cat hair? And something's on. And as part of that, I'm trying a little bit of a new technology setup today, trying to increase the quality of my videos a little bit because I think they've been fine, but they could be better, and I always want it to be better and better. And I've also gotten on kind of a roll this year with regular monthly update videos, so you kind of know what to expect. But they've gotten longer, and as I get to the end of the month and try to think back on what I read at the beginning, it's hard to remember. So I want to kind of piece out some of my thoughts as I go through the month and have shorter videos and just more bite-sized content and be able to share my ideas as I read things more frequently, so I'm not just info dumping at the end of the month and then also forgetting what I read. So it'll be, I think, more interesting. Hopefully I can dive a little deeper and you won't have to slog through such long videos as my last update. So without further ado, today I wanted to talk about some short stories that I read recently. I read 2 collections, and this is also kind of part of my reading books that I've picked up recently as I kind of purge through my TBR list physically, because again, I'm still a little bit struggling with e-reading all the time. So a couple paper books I've had sitting on my shelf for a while and just wasn't in like a short story mood. But apparently I was recently. So I read a couple anthologies. Well, one's more of a collection, one's more of an anthology. And I also created a kind of a space on my bookshelf up here for short story collections, anthologies, magazines, that kind of thing, because they're a different kind of work than a novel. And when I want to pick one up, I want to know where to go on my shelf. And I don't always want to wade through them when I want a novel, which is what I want most of the time. So it just kind of made sense to kind of physically separate them that way. Anyway, I think short stories are more like conversations. They're a bit more literary in a way to me, in that they make me think more about the craft of writing. They let writers take chances and experiment more because they are a shorter form. And you can just read a wider variety of things in a shorter time because they're more bite-sized. So I think about them differently, I read them differently, and they're a really good opportunity to just play with different ideas and see what you're into. And because of that, I read them differently. I will not read front to back. I will read stories as I'm interested. So I've been reading these kind of off and on over the last several months, and then just really dove in and read the rest recently as I was interested. So let me just get into it. The first book was After Realism, and you will see there's a theme in this video of short stories about kind of breaking realism. So After Realism, I picked up recently at McNally Robinson, or not recently, like over the summer, I think. It's called After Realism, 24 Stories for the 21st Century. And this book has a ton of stories in it by a ton of awesome authors. And it first piqued my interest because it has stories by Casey Plett and John Elizabeth Stinson, which are 2 of my recent favorite authors. So seeing them in the book, and then like this eye-catching cover I was seeing all over the place, and seeing their names made me think, okay, this book about kind of post-realism and 2 authors I really like, let's go. So I picked it up. Anyways, let's dive into it. I want to share with you a quote from the intro of the book. We have a quote from Sally Rooney within the quote. So it says, to borrow a phrase from the Irish novelist Sally Rooney, realism tends to rely on the continuous present, a world in which tomorrow is expected to be very similar to today. As COVID-19 has made clear, we no longer have the luxury of assuming present conditions will maintain indefinitely. The exhaustion with realism is not just a matter of taste, but arises from a sense that a realist style can't cope with reality as we now experience it. I love that quote, and like I said, like thinking about short stories kind of more academically or more in terms of the practice of writing and that kind of thing, and like kind of zooming out of what you're doing with the form of fiction and of a short story, often like the intros and the matter surrounding the stories is equally as interesting to me. So I love this intro about like what is realism, because it doesn't click with me. It never really has, and more it doesn't. So I love that kind of idea of realism doesn't make sense to like modern sensibility or current sensibilities, because we can't know that tomorrow is going to be the same as today. The world might fall apart in so many ways or just change. And who knows? Like, we're learning more things about physics all the time. The laws of physics probably won't change, but like things that we know about them and our understanding of the world might change drastically in our place in it. So let's break realism. Let's figure out what's going on. And yeah, I just love that idea. And like I said, this collection has a story by Casey Plett in it, Portland, Oregon, which is also in her recent re-released collection, A Safe Girl to Love, which is about a girl and her talking cat. And they just kind of hang out around the apartment, and it zooms out from there a bit, but it's really about her and her talking cat and kind of the relationship that they share, and is very surreal in that way. Like, it's not really explained why the cat is talking. If it's really talking, is it in her head? So it's really interesting and definitely like plays with the rules of reality. And then another one was to mention was Going Toward Gad by John Elizabeth Stinson, which was a story about a non-binary character kind of dealing with gender dysphoria and like their place in the world and who they are. They're running a social media account for a skeleton on Instagram, I believe. And the skeleton has like more followers than they do and gets like quite a following. And it's just kind of interesting thinking about like, what is a person beneath all of the layers of society when you get to the fundamental nature of like what we are inside, to kind of push that metaphor. It also has alternating chapters with a D&D campaign where the character's playing a character within their character, and then their real life in this journey with the social media skeleton. So a really cool story, again, breaking realism and breaking also like the form as well, like it's presented in a different way. And another story I wanted to mention, I can't go through all of them because there's 24 of them, and I'm trying to keep this brief, was The Aquanauts by Eliza Robertson. And this was another story that was just really beautifully written. Like, her prose was amazing. I loved it so much, just the feel of the story, the language. And it was also presented in a way that both broke realism, because it was about people living under the sea, which isn't something you see every day. And also because it played with form, and it was written kind of like a log, like it was in kind of entries, but also it was written in paragraph form, but like almost listing like things that were happening rather than like long-winded descriptions, or even like the way people talk. It was written in more of like, this happened and this happened and this happened, but in a way that flowed and made sense and was enjoyable to read, especially because of the beautiful language. But yeah, like I feel so seen by this book's existence. Realism is predictable and unsurprising, and also limiting in that it expects tomorrow to be like today. And that, like, the more I think about it, the more that is like kind of my big gripe with realism, is because I don't feel like it does represent the way I see the world, because it always feels like things can get worse or things can get better. And using this predictable structure of how today is to define our entire lives just doesn't make sense. It doesn't feel satisfying. It feels limiting and a bit depressing. And it makes me think too about like thinking about realism, that like the fiction of the past, like I'm thinking back to like early American short stories, which is like kind of my background in like an academic setting of writing, like Poe and Hawthorne and all of that. They were writing like tales at the time. They weren't called short stories, they were called tales. And at the time there were things like fairy tales existed and legends and folklore and that kind of thing. But a short story or tale wasn't like a genre. It wasn't realism or fantasy or whatever. it was fiction, and in fiction anything could happen because it's not real. Like, it's not a recording of events as they happened. It's telling a story, playing with, I don't know, all of the things that we encounter in our lives through like legends and folklores and reality in our day-to-day lives, and what we're feeling and how that can be expressed in different ways, not just by saying like this person cried, like in realism, but like their world fell from underneath them and the earth floated off into space and they were left alone in the vast expanse. Like, you know, like you can use these like crazy sweeping metaphors and things if you suspend yourself from realism a bit, and it has a lot of impact, and I just feel it a lot more personally. So that's After Realism. Really cool book. And then kind of in a similar vein, but different, I read Buffalo is the New Buffalo by Chelsea Vowel. And this is a single author collection, so a bit different from the other one, but also very interesting in terms of realism. And I'll share with you this quote from the back of the book that sums it up better than I could. Education is the new buffalo is a metaphor used among Indigenous peoples in Canada to signify the importance of education to their survival and ability to support themselves, as once Plains nations supported themselves as buffalo peoples. The premise is that many of the pre-contact ways of living are forever gone, so adaptation is necessary. But Chelsea Vowel asks, instead of accepting that the buffalo and our ancestral ways will never come back, what if we simply ensure that they do? And so this book is kind of sci-fi, but she explains a lot why it isn't really or isn't only. And she describes it more as Indigenous or Métis futurism, which isn't limited by genre. And I have a couple quotes here to share with you too that, again, like, sum things up way better than I ever could. She says at one point also in the intro that language is not merely a tool of communication, but also a place where reality can be shaped, which I think goes back to kind of that idea of realism being limiting, but fiction should never have that kind of limit. Like, you don't have to just say what happened. Then you're writing nonfiction. Like, break reality, break realism. And like I was mentioning too, like, short stories often feel really academic. So I'm reading from the intro here. And this book particularly feels very academic. It has like a background at the beginning on like her own personal background with these stories and writing and futurism. It has then a preface, also an introduction, a conclusion, references, only actually 8 short stories, but each one is followed by what she calls explorations that kind of talk about her inspiration, the research that she did for the story, its relevance to the culture. And of course, the stories themselves have generous footnotes as well. So it's really in depth. And reading this, I think, as an academic or as a writer is very interesting, but it's not like a quick escapist fantasy read that many sci-fi or fantasy readers would be expecting, I think, when hearing about it. So just keep that in mind if it sounds interesting to you. It's really interesting from a craft perspective, but maybe not like a light, fun read. I really love the analysis surrounding the stories, including the intro and conclusion, and just how it kind of like puts a beautiful bow on it all, and like really, I don't know, drives home these thoughts about what is futurism, what is our place in the future, what is Indigenous people's place in the future, and what is the future of writing and books as well. Here is another quote from the intro where she's talking about genre, and she says, I am not interested in being overly specific with genre outside of insisting my work is Métis futurist. It may include elements of science fiction and fantasy or not. I wish to, as Grace Dillon puts it, sometimes intentionally experiment with, sometimes intentionally dislodge, sometimes merely accompany, but invariably change the perimeters of speculative fiction, which is awesome. I wanted to briefly mention kind of like another kind of not segue, but tie-in here, is that these stories, coming from the place of Indigenous futurism, have this sense, and she says this in one of the like writing about the writing pieces, that like Indigenous people have already endured many apocalypses, from cultural to like sickness to war to all of these things, seeing their culture collapse and being taken from them in so many different ways, have already dealt with this. So it's not just sci-fi, it's not just the future, it's processing what's happened, what's happening now, and what will happen in the future on a more global scale even. And I think that's a really interesting idea because we can definitely learn a lot there. And this idea was also brought up recently in Canada Reads by Michael Grey Eyes, who was championing Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11. He brought up that idea too, that like apocalypse is not an unfamiliar term or idea to Indigenous peoples. It's kind of a cycle of the world that has been seen many times. So it's not this distant thing that can't happen. It's happening. It's happened. It will keep happening. So buckle up and get ready for it as best you can and live life the best you can. So the stories in this book themselves are about all kinds of things, like she mentioned, could be seen as fantasy or sci-fi, shapeshifters, digitizing consciousness and language, superheroes, apocalypse, post-apocalypse, and that kind of thing. So it spans all of these ideas. Another quote that I wanted to briefly mention is this one I really liked. One of the stories called Buffalo Bird, she talks about in the exploration after, she says, "What is alternate about Buffalo Bird is not imagining that the ability to shapeshift is possible. This is not the point of divergence from our current universe. Indeed, transformation is the one true constant of our reality, and it happens all around us at all points along that fourth dimension we label time." I loved this because it gets at that idea again, I think, that after Realism did, that our world is changing all the time, and we can't just say it's going to be like this tomorrow, because so many things will be different tomorrow. And even just to imagine, not even from a futurist lens, but just to imagine someone living their life and planning ahead for the short term, like who knows what that looks like. So great, I love that idea so much. And I won't go through all the stories here, but I did want to mention one of my favorites, which is called A Lodge Within Her Mind. I'm just going to read you the summary of that because it sums it up way better than I could too. It says, "Pandemic isolation dulls the senses and drains hope. Facing the possibility of having her consciousness uploaded into a digital space where she is the only human being present, a queer Métis woman finds a novel way to escape." So it's kind of about, uploading herself, kind of matrixy, but more like getting in on the ground floor and digitizing your consciousness. She's kind of bored and lonely and looking for what should she do. So she decides to like click on this like clickbait in her email that leads her down this rabbit hole. It's just a really cool, really interesting story. I love this kind of real world setting that shifts perspective, like I talked about in my last video. This is kind of my sweet spot, and this kind of like breaking of genre and breaking of realism. One more quote, and then I promise I'll stop quoting. So this one comes from the exploration of that story I was just talking about, A Lodge in Her Mind, Within Her Mind. "Walking away from colonialism and capitalism isn't entirely possible unless we do it en masse," which I think is a really great reminder to us all that we need to work together. But she goes on to say, "Choosing and acting otherwise is a huge theme throughout my work because I believe in it. Those first few weeks of the pandemic were terrifying and yet also hope-filled. As pollution cleared, the sounds of the city shifted, and we took stock of our relationships. Right now, in September 2021, it feels as though the stranglehold capitalism has on us will only increase, depleting us and the planet forever. It is vital that we remember we can choose. We can dive into sage-colored waters and reclaim ourselves. We can waddle through dark streets and value relationality over possessions. We can transform everything." Such a good book. I love that so much. So that's Buffalo is the New Buffalo. You can see a lot of themes tying throughout these two books, which was really interesting and why I wanted to just make a quick video to talk about them together. But just a final thought on short stories. They can feel challenging and academic, but I like fiction that challenges me, and I've been on this journey to find like pure entertainment through writing And for me, I think sometimes the entertainment often is in delving into things a little deeper. And I feel a bit bored by like straightforward narratives, whether that's realism or like a more traditional high fantasy novel or even like a cookie cutter space opera. Like I like these ideas of kind of deconstructing things, tearing it apart. Let's tear it apart together and make a more beautiful world. So yeah, great books. And anyways, I'd love to hear what you think about short stories. Do you like them? Do you not like them? Do you love to hate them? Hate to love them? Whatever. Have you read any good short stories lately? Let me know in the comments below. But that is it for today. I will come at you with some more videos in the near future and talk about these again briefly in my monthly wrap up, but I wanted to just kind of spill some thoughts on them now and do a deeper dive. So anyway, I hope you're doing well wherever you are and whatever you're doing, and I will let you get back to your reading. See you next time.